Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to speak, I know some of you have been on your feet all day. Joining us today for this Curatorial walkthrough are Deborah Weiner, curator for this exhibition, and curator for the larger Bethlehem project, and Danielle Nekimken, who's the designer. And we're also zooming out to whomever's going to make it in person today. So I am going to just ask that we try to speak loudly and then say as much as we can through our masks. And Ani, just let me know if people can't hear, if indeed there are people there. I guess I would just say for a bit of context, I don't want to assume, so I will say that this exhibition is sort of like one part of a much larger project at the museum called the Bethlehem Legacy Project, which includes all kinds of activities and includes like almost everybody here, probably everybody here on staff. So collecting, programming, even some of the events maybe we've done here. And but this is sort of our the capstone of 3 years of work and relationship building. So Deb has been with us through the entire project, and I'm wondering, Deb, if you wouldn't mind just kind of joining me up here on stage. And I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how you feel like this exhibition fits into the larger Bethlehem Legacy project.
This is, like you said, the capstone of the project. But we knew from the beginning that the space was going to be really not big enough to say enough about that steel and all the things we were planning out. So I like it to be seen as just a part of the steel project. We have to actually be try to choose what aspects we want to talk about in the exhibit, since it's such a large project, so many different ways that we could have gone. So I think it fits in as a way to sort of emphasize the importance of that steel and to give people an introduction, really. I mean, I see it more of an introduction to steel than, the end of the story. It's like the beginning of the story. And for people who just come casually to take a look, they're going to get sort of the basics of the Beth Steel story, and maybe not even all of the basics, but they're going to get a little piece of the experience that they can take home, and if they're interested, they can find out more. But in terms of the whole Bethlehem Steel project, and what it means to me, say that the people we talk to, all the people who live in Sparrows Point, the people who used to work at the mill, it's really just a part of the larger project.
Any questions about the Beth Steel Legacy project more generally? I guess I would ask you what you think just now in terms of fire and shadow. What are some of the very key messages that you as our curator are hoping people will walk away with?
Well, we wanted to give people just an inkling of the experience of the people who work here. So that's why we kind of divided it. The whole wall section is really about looking at it from the experience of the steelworkers. What it was like to work at the point, and what it was like to live in the community. So as opposed to say, the history is not on the wall. What you have on the wall is kind of like a composite of the experiences of people who work there. And we divided that into sections that when I did the research, when we talked to people, a lot of it was oral histories of people who lived at the mill or lived around the mill or who worked at the mill. In addition to, newspaper articles, secondary sources, all the more traditional kind of historical sources that we use. The themes that stood out to us as being important are these subcategories that you see here. which are, what struck me is, one thing I really didn't know about was how generations of families sent people to work at Sparrows Point. And that was really a part of, it became a whole part of the whole culture, because people's parents were there, their grandparents, and it made the experience really more intense than otherwise, because there's a whole family history wrapped up for many, many people. So that struck me as an important point to emphasize. And then union and equality for both sections about workers fighting for justice based on, what they found when they went to work in the mill. So for African Americans and women, they were definitely discriminated against. And we wanted to show that workers, had agency, and they really wanted to improve conditions for themselves. And that's where we talk about equality, which was African Americans. Steelworkers basically won certain rights. And then union, of course, going back to, touches a little bit on history, because you have to start with how terrible conditions were for workers in the steel industry before unionization. And then, quickly bring people, you can only do that in like a few sentences, unfortunately. Behind that is, articles that we found, tons of articles about accidents and, terrible things that happened. The low pay, the tremendous hours that people had to work. Just encapsulate that a little bit and show how workers had to fight to get better conditions and to get paid what they deserve for working there. And union is particularly important because what a lot of people remember about that steel is that it allowed workers to lead a middle-class lifestyle, and the wages are high, or relatively high for working class jobs. But the reason that the wages were decent was because of the union, and that's something that we felt absolutely had to be in the exhibit. Even today, when you hear about people talk about, manufacturing jobs are like the city, and these warehouse jobs are not as high paid. Well, the reason for that is largely because of unionization, and that often gets left out of the story. So that was important, and also was part of the culture of the people who were union members, and the union was a big part of their lives too. So we have the generations union equality, and then danger and bonds are the other two sections. The things that we want to stress that basically came from, mostly from our oral histories, was what it was like to work in the mill and how important the camaraderie was of the people who worked there. And that's what the bonds section goes into a little bit. And one of the reasons of this tremendous camaraderie was because of how dangerous the mill was and how people had to rely on each other, and what that does to, when you're working with a group of people that you count on them for your survival, what that does for your, for that group. It becomes a very close-knit group. So those were things that stood out when we talked to people. Another thing that stood out that doesn't have its own separate section, but runs through the whole thing, I think, is the pride that people felt in working at Bethlehem for all those reasons. Pride and, the fact that their families had been there for so long. Pride in the fact that they worked under these dangerous conditions. And pride in the fact that they were able to achieve a middle-class lifestyle for their families. So I sort of tried to weave that into pretty much many of the sections so that people understood, instead of just saying, that as a separate section, because it was sort of intertwined with every single thing. So that's just the first, 2/3. And then the last third, I don't actually remember when we decided we need to talk about not just working at the point, but living around the point. But that was always a critical part of what we wanted to do. I talk about Sparrows Point as a community that involved not just steelworkers, but their families as well. And we interviewed not just steelworkers, but we also interviewed sons and daughters of steelworkers, people who lived in the area who maybe just had a little bit of connection with that steel, and came up with this section about living at the point. And that we divided into three major parts also. One was the company town in Sparrows Point itself, which is a fascinating place that could have its own whole exhibition, and is completely gone now. It was actually destroyed in the 1970s when Bethlehem Steel decided to expand the mill. Well, they built it, they outlasted it. They pretty much destroyed what they kept. Through the years, they would use chunks of the town they would, get rid of chunks of town to expand the mill, and finally the town was gone by 1974. But also two of the communities that grew up around Sparrows Point, which were Trinder Station and Dundalk. So we just wanted to get a little bit of sense of what life was like, the whole culture of Sparrows Point, and how just the culture revolved around the steel mill. So that's the wall, well, the main wall. And then on the side wall, again, we wanted the whole wall to really be focused more on the workers' experience. So you get the decline of the mills more or less through the eyes of the people who lived and worked there, as opposed to, just like a listing of all the factors that led to the decline and that kind of thing. It's really more of an experiential thing of what was it like to be there at the end. So that's that main decision that we made to sort of focus on the experience of the workers is what created the bulk of the museum, of the exhibit. But then we have, we need context. You can't just be dropped into the story without knowing anything about it and get a lot out of it just by, working, learning about what it was like to work the mill. So the rail panel is supposed to fill in sort of the context, and it's like a chronological timeline of the history of Sparrows Point. And we tried to cram in as much as we could. A lot is left out, but we tried to hit all highlights of, why was Sparrows Point, why was the mill built there, the geographical factors that made it a great spot to build a steel mill. What happened when Bethlehem Steel took over, because it wasn't originally owned by Bethlehem Steel, it was owned by another company, but Steel took over in 1916. And then how it rose to become such an important steel mill to the American economy, to the war effort in World War II. And then how it declined in the late 20th century, and talk a little bit about all the factors that caused the mill to rise, and then also the factors that caused the mill to decline. But it's a very complicated story, and I'm not sure, how good a job we could have done about talking about the decline, but we tried to, at least show that this was a complex thing. It couldn't be attributed to one thing, like foreign steel or something like that. So that's what we basically tried to do.
Thank you, Deb. I mean, it does sound like just a Herculean task to try and tell such a big story in a concise way, in a way that provides some context and then highlights these key pieces, and also meets the needs of people for whom this is a story they may not be very familiar with, and then also people who are really invested and maybe even experienced this history. Thank you.
Oh, that's good.
I do have a question because, we've got gorgeous images, we have, incredibly well-crafted text, but we also have some objects. So I was wondering if you could just share, one or two stories that you have as a curator about some of the 3D pieces here. We haven't really even talked about this case, so just imagining getting questions from visitors about some of the artifacts.
Well, the artifacts, some of them the museum already had. Like a lunchbox, for example, had been donated by the daughter of a steel worker. I'm not sure exactly when, but 2008. And then other things are things that we collected or that were found at Tree Plant Lab when the collections team went in and got the objects that were everybody over at the Sparrows Point. So, you know, again, there wasn't room to have a lot of objects, so we had to decide which ones to use. And rather than simply say, okay, we're going to take the best objects that we love the best, we decided to be more thematic about it and collect things that help tell a story. So this display here tells the generation story, with every object being, we have a wrench in there. It's not a spectacular wrench, but it happens to be a wrench that was work at Sparrows Point. His father also used. His father passed the wrench down to him, so we could tell that little story. He was one of the people that we interviewed. Edie Papadakis, her hard hat, you know, she talks about in an oral history that Bill Berry did about all her family who worked at the mill and what it was like on her first day at the job, and her father actually came to watch her at work, which was a pretty compelling story. So that's how we selected her hard hat. And we had images to back up these stories. So we chose objects that can tell a story that might have accessories to go along with. Same with the other. We were more limited, I think, in the number of objects that we had from Sparrows Point. So those, I think, we put out a call. We didn't get a lot of great answers to the call in terms of objects that people had. But we did find enough things that talk a little bit about what it was like to live in the area. And then around the corner is the display case. And most of the objects, well, maybe about half and half, objects that were found at Sparrows Point and objects that were donated to us by a couple different steelworkers. And we just kind of threw as many articles in there as we could. That one we had to make a lot of choices because there's a lot that we did. But we weren't able to, you know, say, well, this is the outfit of a person who worked in this particular section, because we had things from all over, people who work all over the mill, so we tried to make it clear in the text, I don't know how clear it is, that we put on the mannequin objects or clothing that wasn't all used by one person or at one stop, but that represented protective clothing that people in different parts of the mill would wear for different reasons. So, and it kind of goes along with the danger theme that mannequin.
I have one more question before I'm going to ask Danielle to join the conversation. But as you sort of think back on your 3 years with this project, or even specifically just this piece, this exhibit, was there ever a moment where you suddenly were like, oh, like a moment where you're like, okay, it's all coming together, I get it. In your process of trying to tell this story, was there ever a moment? And if not, that's okay. But if you could share just some other kind of like a moment for you as curator of the show that really stood out for you, that really helped kind of like propel you on this longer arc towards putting it all together.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't even remember when we exactly decided you know, how to focus the exhibit, or who came up with the idea. I think it was a combination of us that, you know, we would do the rail panel as the history and the wall as the workers' experience, but deciding that we would focus on the workers' experience was an important moment, because up until that point, I was just like, how can we possibly do this? It's not faith, it's just not possible. And, you know, narrowing things down is not something that, you know, it's not one of my strong points. So that was important. But in terms of like discovery of Evelyn Steele, I think that really happened all the way along. I mean, at certain points, you know, people in their courses would say things that were very illuminating. I remember actually one community meeting when somebody stood up, and people, I would go out into the community and invited to some of the local community organizations. And this was a meeting in or maybe it was the one at the North Point Library, where that we set up our own meetings too, where we were talking about the pros and cons of working at the steel mill. And this one guy said, well, it was a deal with the devil. And that ended up not even going to me. He said, I had it in the text for a long, long time, finally got cut out. But that really clarifies a lot about what it was like to work at the steel mill and what, the attitude of the workers, that they knew how dangerous it was and all the bad conditions and all the drawbacks, yet the benefits were worth it to them. And just that whole concept of the deal with the devil, more or less, I think, informs the exhibit, even though the phrase itself isn't anymore. But that was kind of an illuminating moment in terms of not just for the people who work there, but for the people who live there and were exposed to, all the environmental problems and heard all the loud noises, but yet lived in a very close-knit community and remember loving living in Sparrows Point. So that was a present.
Danielle.
Yes.
So I guess I would just ask you as the designer on the team, what were you trying to achieve or communicate with some of these design elements, whether it's this like roll of steel or the fact that this wall is not standing straight, it's a leaning wall. Can you talk a little bit about some of, like, at least those two design elements? Because I think they're pretty, they're asking to be talked about, yeah.
As Deb said, when this became a lot about the workers' experience, I think we started to think a lot about like, what was it like to be at Bethlehem scale? What was it like to be a worker? And there are a few big things, big things. It's big. I mean, it was a gigantic place, and everything. And they say everything was so enormous, and it was just, and things are over you, under you, all around you. The distances were so far, and so they had to ride a tricycle because it was, like to get from here to there, this building to that building. You wanted to take a bike, not just walk. It was a huge place, and it was dramatic. There was, literally molten metal, fire, burning, smoke. It was incredible, and it was hard to put all of that because, of course, I wanted the smoke and fire, but you can't have all of it. What I was hoping is that by having this wall sort of leaning towards you, and to have this steel texture, was that you had a sense of the scale of it, that it was big and looming, and it loomed in its community, and it loomed for the workers that were in the space, that it was kind of big ladles of molten metal were pouring around you. And so that's part of this feeling that it's coming out, that was just so large. And here even you see in this picture, the plant itself is moving over the town where the people live. So it's always there. Whether you were in the plant or you were out of the plant, it was still this big presence. So that's the reason for it to be here. And even so much as the names of the streets were named after blast rooms and so on. Then we really wanted to get some more actual, as many artifacts as possible. We talked about the artifacts. And so it would have been great if this would have been solid steel, very heavy and maybe dangerous, probably possible. So that's where then it was. But the idea of the sensitive, the emotional part of it was the primary. And then to get some real materials in it, to do real steel, we brought in other places. So if it came around and then trims here, and in this, really important, this roll of steel, which kind of bookends the exhibit, because you start here with this roll of steel, where the history of that Bethlehem steel kind of spools out, right, from this point. This is a 2,800-pound roll, and it's very petite, compared to what they have. And if you use the augmented reality portion of the exhibit, you can get a sense of how big the big rolls were. But it starts here in this piece, and then you end over this photo at the end here with the last roll coming off this is the last coil. So you begin here with the steel coil, you end here with the steel coil. So it's really nice. And then you have a sense of what this actual material was, was like. And this particular time was given, this roll was given by Titan Steel, which is another steel company in town, and they donated it. And they told us that this particular type is called galvanism, and it's a type, a specific type that Bethlehem Steel invented. So while this doesn't come from Bethlehem Steel, it is like a Bethlehem Steel product because of its treatment.
There is a label that says that.
Yes,
The label.
it
Label is
was.
not.
There is a label.
There is a label.
And otherwise, I think bringing together, when you talk about the worker experience, the looming quality, the actual, the heft and the weight of the materials, distances you had to travel, the tiny bit that, like how small are you? It's almost like a Where's Waldo in this picture of the shipyard, where the people are so small, you have to like really look to find the tiny person who's really this big, because the steel is just so massive. And then when you get to the case down here at the end, it's about like this one-on-one. What was the personal experience being face to face with that hot molten metal, and what it was like to be in awe of it and to try to protect yourself from it, by wearing the gear. So in this part, when you really feel like you're right in front of it and you can sense the action happening. And so those are I think those are the key parts from design perspective. But there was just so much to put in.
I just want to throw in, Ani, I know I didn't prepare you for this, but Ani and Deb and I did add 3 audio stops here in the wall. I don't know, Ani, if you want to just talk a little bit about that element, that interpreted element.
Yeah, well, that kind of goes along with what Deb was mentioning of really focusing on the worker perspective. As many of you in the audience today, your voices in other galleries, so it's much more from the perspective of a museum staff member. This is audio from the workers at Beth Steel, not from the museum's perspective. So we had some great audio assets. Deb and Joseph had done some oral histories, and then Aaron Hinken had recorded the podcast series. So we had like hours and hours of audio to choose from. So there's just 3 like 60 to 90-second clips per stop, and there's 3 stops total. So I think it's just another way to hear from the workers themselves, and some of them, like Kathy Garrison, she also has some quotes on the wall. Some of them, Eddie Bartucci is pictured on the wall. So hopefully it's really just helping to add a face and a name and a voice to the story. And if you haven't already listened to it, definitely check it out, test it out. And the great thing about this audio guide is that we can update and add, if there's really something missing, or, we want to take away something or change the focus, we can do that.
And then Mike, I know it was Jessica who took the lead on the touch box, and I know that Jessica worked closely with you, Jane. I don't know, Mike, if you want to say anything about the touch box, or I can, Jane, if you have any thoughts? Show and tell.
I'd be happy to add a label.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
I'm not entirely sure if I know off the top of my head what's in here. I know the theme is it's largely safety equipment. So there's arts jackets, which I believe the jackets were donated by steelworkers. Is that correct?
So everything in there, there might be some that's obviously a reproduction, not the
Yes.
size. But there are actual artifacts in there that we collected by the kids, when we were collecting materials for the collection as well as the exhibit, we wanted to have extras, because, you know, we love the hands-on, the teachers love the hands-on, the kids love the hands-on, so we just kept that in mind. So those are the wooden shoes that the workers wear. There's an actual pair that was worn in the plant. It's that shown you. Those are actual, ones that Mike has, I don't believe are ever used. But the workers, use them so the soles of their shoes wouldn't melt, basically. So it is again, the two jackets are plain, retardant. One is full, one is a special down, that they wore in different parts of the plant.
So-
Safety
Yep.
goggles.
Hard hats, which are not Bethlehem steel, we just
Yeah.
added the circus ourselves, and some safety goggles,
Yeah.
which I think were
Yeah.
our collection. so to
Right.
speak.
But it is wonderful, to have a colleague like Jane, who's always thinking about visitors and hands-on elements. I'm so lucky to have these things that aren't just reproductions, they're this incredible gift. And then, yeah, I think I already know people are using touchbox comments in various places, so, and there's more information if you'd like to have a look at these articles. And then I guess my last question before we get to Q&A, and hopefully you have questions, but this one's for both of you, Deb and Danielle. What do you feel you gained from working on this project with us? What are you taking away with you? What are you most proud of? What do you feel, how are you feeling in terms of reflecting back on working with us and working with this material and putting this all together?
I can't believe what an awesome presence the Bethlehem Steel Plant had in Baltimore. And even living in Baltimore for a long time, really having zero idea what it's like inside the plant, or even around the community, what the impact it had on the community around. Because now it's invisible. It's really invisible. I just had no sense of what that was like, and I think that the worker stories, the direct quotes from them really help in understanding what it felt like to be there. I think that's the most important thing, and how difficult that was. You know, it was really hard work, and also that it was, so meaningful to them. That was one thing I really learned, that how much it meant to people to be a part of something so big and so important. Like, if you made a ship like that, it's like you're a part of something physically big and just conceptually big, working together with those people. And that was amazing. And what a loss. And then understanding what a loss it was when it went away, it just seems so much more.
Yeah, and I would agree that, just getting to go down to Dundalk and Edgeware and places like that and speak to people, do the interviews with people, was definitely the most fun part. It's, enjoyable to meet all these people and, let them talk about their experience and, one thing that struck me was, how much it meant to them. Somebody was interested and somebody wanted to capture their experience. So to me, that was the most important aspect. This is an important story. It's a story that hasn't been told really enough in Baltimore. And without the mill there anymore, it's a story that could easily be completely forgotten except by the people who went through it. And that they were just sort of, waiting for someone to come along and tell their story. I would say that was definitely, and for me, it was all, new, it's a topic I didn't know that well, so being able to learn all these new things and, find out, I was learning, one thing about putting this together is I was not an expert of the topic at all, so, I was learning as I went, and so that was really fascinating.
You. Any questions from anyone?
There's one question from Zoom before I forget.
Yeah.
Could you just repeat the name of the type of steel that was?
It's a galvalume.
Galvalume.
Yeah, it's sort of like, sounds like galvanized aluminum, galvalume.
Oh,
Sounds like galvalume, but it's not galvanized. It's steel, but it's called galvalume.
did you have a question, Jane?
I was just gonna say, just made me think of something when you were saying there about we're not an expert at all, we're learning. That maybe that's your advantage in being able to create this. Had you been someone that was emotionally or, historically attached to the subject, whether you would have been able to sort of divorce yourself from that knowledge to create this, because this is a worker story. And for the most part, I hadn't really thought about it before until you said that, and I thought, I'm wondering if, I see it as maybe as an advantage of that, you kind of went into it sort of blind.
Yeah, maybe, I think that's true. You want to make sure you get it right too, though. And, that you know what people about the story really are. So there might be experts who might disagree about that, but then, that's only one half of the exhibit. The other half is thinking about the audience and what they're going to, relate to. It's not just, you're not just putting a history reference to on the wall. That's not what the exhibit is about. So, from that standpoint, I think, going to these meetings and finding out what was important to people and being able to put that directly, on the wall was, other people might have come in if they were already well versed and not paid as much attention to that because they knew of some of the other very important things that maybe we need to talk about. But it's certainly related to the choices that we make. Whether those are the right choices or not is still debatable. That's how I sort of say that.
That's a big steel ladle, which is,
Quite finished.
it's not, it has a, but the idea is that the metal will be pouring out of this ladle and into this pool that you see on the floor.
So it mimics the photo.
Yeah. So,
Right. We're gonna, I think, do some things to make it look more like that. Haven't been done yet. Originally, I don't get into problems or things that we didn't do, but originally we were gonna have a column leading from the ladle down to the fiery portion of the floor, which was going to be like fire. Animated fire. But I ended up just not working on it. With Daniel.
everything doesn't work.
As you but, so now there's a gap between the ladle and the floor, which made it a little more mysterious.
This is almost like another bookend. So there's the steel coil that appears here and in there. There's the ladle that appears here and over there, like a bookend. And then the third bookend is this here. It's here is actually falling down at the end of the image. That's a big image.
I think the ladle is going to actually have some in it.
Yeah.
And there's going to be graphics.
Yeah.
So it will become more.
In the, it was a little bit hard to do actual ladle outside that is in there. we did talk about that, about how we should put it.
That's something we can mention when we're talking to visitors too.
My own thought, no, I want to drop. You know, we talk about the scale.
Right.
You know, but we have miniature everything. You know, and
Yeah.
Again, and it's like, what scale,
Yeah,
that ladle outside.
is
gives
that
you some
scale.
concept. of
Right.
scale.
Well, it's hard when you're standing in here to get in there, and we did talk about like how we picture of the one that's outside and refer to it, or we put this. We did talk about how do you get that, and one of the ways that we thought we would bridge that is by using the augmented reality piece. So the augmented reality piece could put things more in actual scale in the space without having a ladle as large as an actual ladle. But it is, how do you think would be best to connect people to one another?
I'm like, I think simple thoughts, it's like, could we put a sign up with an arrow? You know, follow the gold line up. You know,
Yeah,
you know, what
yeah.
I'm saying is like, you know,
Yeah,
I
there's
come
some
back
way
to
to
you
say,
all.
by the way, we got a real one.
right, there's a real one outside.
Doesn't
Yeah.
have to be more than that.
Right.
Yeah, and I come back to us, you know, if we're talking with visitors, be sure to mention that. You
So
know,
there's an actual.
Yeah.
space.
Well, and also one of the, you know, pretty very similar to the one pictured there is also standing out.
Right.
Well, I just want to be mindful of time. It's 2:45. So if there's any other questions for Deb and Danielle, now is a great time to ask it.
But I think it's more for Jane, like I know listening to Steph talk about just, the tough decisions about, getting things into such a small scale. I know that you and your team took in so many objects. Like, can you talk a little bit about the collections and like what state they're in now and like what the plans are?
So Curtis, $500. Yeah. So, it seemed like 500, right? And we have, I wish I had this here, a couple hundred clamshell boxes upstairs of archival material. So it really was a 3-year cataloging process for the whole department, including volunteers and interns. The artifacts, just FYI, the museum has actually been collecting artifacts of Bethlehem scale since the late 1980s. But Trade Point gets a lot of credit because we got a huge influx of materials from them. But also back in 2016, there was a salvage collector, or salvage business that did a lot of the salvage work at Bethlehem scale after it closed. And he's been in front of the museum for a long time. And we also went to his warehouse of materials where we collected more material from him directly. It came from Sparrows Point. And then the last set of material that we got was from actual workers or workers' families, workers' children, in some cases grandchildren, that came with a lot of the stories that they're about. Tell more specifics about.
Yeah, so the one thing I would like to emphasize is that this focuses on steel making, the mill itself. The other half is shipping. So the other half of things like so and to an equal degree, whether as far as lunchboxes or it's engineering tools, all of our archival documentation, ship plans,
Very
kinds of things.
Cool.
I have a question for the ed team. Is this, I know you guys think you're towards school groups, I know you have to. Is this going to be a script that will be worked into it, you think eventually, or?
I think we need to talk about it. As you know, we also like have lunch, in various spots, sometimes out here. But I don't think
it would be that hard to, I mean, I see there are similar themes. So I think certainly for our weekend audiences, I really do want to make sure we have some kind of mention of this. And then in terms of school tours, I guess we're just gonna have to sort of see, because as you know, they're on a set choreography at the moment. So we have to think about, how it all works on the impact floor and how the stories match up with what we're trying to achieve. Mike, do you want to add anything?
Are there any plans for the space behind the exhibit?
Yeah, Anita, would you like to take that one?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the wonderful side benefits of putting the exhibition here, as we did, is that it created a gallery space, which is pretty clean there. Pretty clean, and the way Danielle designed this was very mindfully of the fact that one day we might want to enter. So the shipbuilding portion, sort of stand on its own, and the exhibition can start to the right of the center with the rest of the way. So, and actually what's back there is sort of a movable now. So the answer is yes, we foresee it being a temporary exhibition gallery, but we don't have either the plans or the funding. So it's really an opportunity. We did like the idea of taking a little bit of the Bethlehem project on and maybe doing sort of a highlights of the things we've collected. We ended up just putting in our interview with this. So it's something for the future. It opens up another opportunity because as we know, our temporary exhibition gallery is cheap. And this is like 1,000 square feet, almost 1,100. And the little gallery is only 200. So it's kind of just an extra gift that we got in the exhibition.
Because all the things that we have, we can just send it in there, take a look.
Yeah, I think part of it is a financial decision, but it could be that if we create something for that gallery, it would be that one. We certainly have enough things, and there is certainly enough for it.
We thought about that all the time. And for the other part of the exhibit.
Yeah.
There is a lot.
Yeah, we played with a lot of ideas, like listening gallery in there, collecting things. In the end, it was more than the scope of the project.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Deb and Danielle. This concludes my portion of today's program. Did you want to say anything about the November staff meetings?
Oh, yeah,